They sold my car while I was sleeping to pay their debts. A month later, I became the owner of a Tesla through the bedroom window. I had a clear view of our driveway, and for the past 25 years, the first thing I saw every morning was the gentle curve of a Highland green fender, my 1968 Ford Mustang. I threw back the covers, my heart starting a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. The space on the driveway where it should have been was starkly, brutally empty. A dark oil stain on the pavement was the only proof it had ever been there. For a dizzying moment, I thought it had been stolen. A wave of violation and fear washed over me. I ran downstairs, my mind racing. I needed to call the police, check the security cameras, wake my husband, David. He was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with our son, Leo, and Leo's wife, Sophia. They weren't frantic. They weren't on the phone with the police. They were just sitting there, under the harsh glare of the overhead light, 3 statues carved from guilt. Sophia was staring into a cold cup of coffee. Leo was picking at a loose thread on his jeans. David, my husband of 30 years, wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's gone," I said, my voice a strangled whisper. "The Mustang. Someone stole it." David cleared his throat. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not the shared panic of a victim, but the weary resignation of a co-conspirator. "Catherine," he said, his voice low, "nobody stole it. We need to talk." And then the story tumbled out, a sordid, ugly confession that unraveled the entire tapestry of my life. Leo, my brilliant, charming son, the one I had poured all my hopes into, was in trouble. Deep trouble. It wasn't gambling this time, or a bad investment. It was credit card debt. A mountain of it, accumulated through a lifestyle he and Sophia couldn't possibly afford. Designer clothes, lavish dinners, a desperate, pathetic attempt to project an image of wealth they didn't possess. They were facing lawsuits, wage garnishments, ruin. The debt was over $60,000, Leo mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. They were going to take everything, Mom. The bank, the collectors. We were drowning. Sophia began to cry, the soft, helpless sobs of a silent partner in crime. "We didn't know what else to do," she whimpered. Leo was a mess. We were so scared. I stood there, frozen in the center of my own kitchen, as the pieces clicked into place. My mind flashed back to a conversation a week ago. Leo had asked me about the Mustang's title, where I kept it. He'd framed it as a casual question about insurance. I, foolishly, had told him it was in the lockbox in my office. I remembered David, just last night, asking me if I had taken a sleeping pill for my occasional insomnia. I hadn't, but he had brought me a cup of chamomile tea, insisting it would help me rest. A deep, heavy, unnatural sleep that had kept me oblivious while my life was being dismantled. "So you sold it," I said. It wasn't a question. The empty space in the driveway was the answer. "While I was asleep, you took my keys, took the title from my office, and you sold my car." "We had to, Catherine," David said, his voice pleading. "It was the only way. It was just sitting there. You barely drive it. It's just a thing. This was about our son's future, our family." Just a thing. The words echoed in the cavernous space that had just opened up inside my chest. It wasn't just a thing. It was my father's car. It was the last tangible piece of him I had left. It was Sunday drives after he died, the smell of old leather and gasoline a ghostly embrace. It was the one asset in my name alone, the one thing that was unequivocally mine, a symbol of the independence my father had always preached. They hadn't just sold a car. They had sold my history. They had sold my last connection to my dad. They had forged my name, drugged my tea, and committed grand larceny against their own wife and mother. A wave of nausea and vertigo swept over me. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. The shock was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. But underneath it was a more insidious feeling, a profound, crushing wave of self-blame. How had I not seen this? How had I raised a son so morally bankrupt? How had I lived with a husband for 30 years and not known he was capable of such a profound betrayal? I had been so wrapped up in my love for them, so blinded by my role as the family matriarch and savior, that I had failed to see the rot spreading right under my own roof. I had failed myself. I had failed my father's memory. And in that moment, the loss of the car was nothing compared to the loss of the woman I thought I was. The rest of that day passed in a thick, surreal fog. I moved through the rooms of my house like a ghost, the silence from the kitchen table following me, thick with their unsaid expectations. They expected tears. They expected screaming. They expected a dramatic emotional outburst that they could then manage and soothe, recasting themselves as the reluctant but necessary saviors of their own crisis. When the emotion finally subsided, they expected me to do what I had always done: forgive, absorb the loss, and help them clean up the mess. They were waiting for the matriarch, the fixer, to reemerge and make it all okay. But the emotional storm never came. The shock had been so profound, so foundational, that it had short-circuited all the usual wires. I felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. That night, I didn't sleep in the bed I shared with David. I lay on the sofa in my office, the room where they had rifled through my private things to find the title. I stared at the ceiling, and instead of tears, my mind began to do what it did best: organize, catalog, and analyze. The librarian in me took over, and I began the grim task of counting my losses. This wasn't the first time. The awakening was not a sudden lightning strike, but the final, dawning realization of a pattern that had been repeating for years. I started a mental ledger. There was the $10,000 I loaned Leo for his wedding to Sophia, money that was never repaid and never intended to be. The $15,000 I'd given them 2 years ago to consolidate their minor credit card debt, a problem they had assured me was a one-time mistake. I thought of David's failed business venture 5 years back, a sure thing that had cost me nearly $40,000 from my own inheritance. Each transaction had been framed as an emergency, a crisis that only I could solve. Each time, I had stepped in, believing I was holding my family together, being the strong one. Now I saw it for what it was. I hadn't been a support column. I had been the quarry from which they mined their resources. My love, my stability, my financial prudence. It was all just material for them to excavate and use to fill the holes in their own reckless lives. And I had let them. I had enabled them. The self-blame from the morning began to curdle into a harder, more rational anger. The Mustang was different. It wasn't just money from a fungible account. It was a classic, a 1968 fastback in pristine condition. My father and I had spent years restoring it. It was a piece of automotive art, a piece of my soul. I knew its value. A quick search on my phone confirmed my fears. Models in similar condition were selling for anywhere between $70,000 and $90,000. They hadn't just sold a car to pay a $60,000 debt. They had liquidated my most valuable and sentimentally priceless asset, likely for a fraction of its worth, to the first shady, no-questions-asked buyer they could find. As dawn broke, I rose from the sofa. The fog had lifted, and in its place was a crystalline, diamond-hard clarity. The point of transition had arrived. The emotional pain was still a deep thrumming beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control. My rational mind was now at the helm. I walked into the kitchen. They were there again, waiting. They looked tired, but hopeful. They probably thought my silent withdrawal meant I was processing my grief and moving towards acceptance. "I need to know exactly how much you got for it," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice I used at the library when dealing with a difficult patron. Leo flinched. "Mom, that doesn't matter." "It is the only thing that matters," I interrupted, my tone firm, cutting him off. "How much?" $55,000, David answered quietly. It was a cash offer. fast. No paperwork hassles. Of course. They had likely sold it for a criminally low price to an unscrupulous buyer who knew a stolen title deal when he saw one. They had probably been so desperate they didn't even negotiate. They had set a $70,000 asset on fire to generate $55,000 in cash. I see, I said. I looked at each of them, my son, my daughter-in-law, my husband. For the first time, I saw them not as family, but as rivals who had staged a successful raid on my life. You have crossed a line from which there is no return. Your financial problems are no longer my concern. Your debts are your own. The safety net you have relied on your entire life has just been packed up and put away. Sophia started to cry. Catherine, please don't say that. I am not finished, I said, my voice like ice. For the first time, I am choosing myself. You have until the end of the month. I want $75,000 in my bank account, the median market value for my property. I don't care how you get it. Sell your own things, get second jobs, take out a loan, but you will make me whole. This is not a negotiation. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them in a stunned silence. The bond of familial obligation, which I had allowed to become a set of chains, had just been broken, and the sound of them shattering was the first note in a symphony of my own liberation. My ultimatum was met not with remorse or a frantic scramble to make amends, but with a tidal wave of indignation. They seemed genuinely shocked that I would not simply absorb this violation as I had all the others. My calm, firm resolve was something they had never encountered before, and they reacted to it as if I were a malfunctioning appliance in need of a hard reset. Their invasion, which had begun with the theft of my car, now moved into a new, psychological phase. The goal was no longer just to take from me, but to break me. The first wave of attack was a coordinated campaign of guilt. They began to treat me like a cruel, unreasonable matriarch, a heartless creditor. How can you be so cold? Sophia would ask, her eyes wide with manufactured disbelief. We're your family. We made a mistake, a terrible one, but we did it out of desperation. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive? Her tears were a constant presence, a manipulative drizzle in the oppressive climate of the house. David's approach was to appeal to the sanctity of our marriage, a sanctity he had apparently forgotten when he conspired to sell my property. 30 years, Catherine, he would say, cornering me in the hallway. We've been through everything together. Sickness, health, richer, poorer. Is this how you're going to treat me? Like a common criminal? It was for our son. A father is supposed to protect his son. He painted his betrayal as a noble, paternal sacrifice, and my demand for restitution as a personal attack on his fatherhood. Leo, on the other hand, oscillated between pathetic pleading and sullen anger. One moment he would be at my feet, figuratively, promising to pay me back every cent, someday, somehow. The next, he would be slamming doors, muttering about how I never understood the pressure he was under, how it was my fault for not helping him sooner, before things got so desperate. He was a master of deflecting blame. In his narrative, my car wasn't stolen. It was a casualty of my own maternal neglect. When guilt failed to move me, they pivoted to accusations and threats. My demand for $75,000 was framed as an act of pure avarice. It's not about the car anymore, is it? Mark sneered one evening, after I had once again refused to engage with their emotional theatrics. You're trying to profit from our misery. You always resented how much Mom helped us. This is your payback. The most potent threat, however, was a social one. They began to subtly poison the well with our extended family and friends. I learned from my sister, Sarah, that David had called her, his voice heavy with sorrow, to tell her I was having some kind of breakdown. He explained that I had become obsessed with money and material things, that I was not myself, since the car had to be sold for a family emergency. He was laying the groundwork to isolate me, to paint me as the unstable, irrational party. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. It was a cold war fought in shared spaces. Meals were eaten in stony silence. If I entered a room, they would stop talking. They started misplacing things I needed. My reading glasses, my library card, the mail. They were small, petty acts of sabotage designed to unnerve me, to make me feel like I was losing control. One evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen, their voices low but charged with anger. "She's not going to budge," Leo said. "We have to do something else. We can't let her ruin us." "What can we do?" Sophia fretted. "She's going to go to the police, I know it." "No," David said, his voice dangerously calm. "She won't. Because if she does, we'll tell them she agreed to the sale and is now trying to extort us. We'll tell them she's mentally unstable. It will be our word, the word of a loving, concerned family, against hers. Who do you think they'll believe?" I stood in the darkened hallway, my blood running cold. The invasion was moving into its final, most dangerous stage. They were no longer just trying to manage me or wear me down. They were planning to destroy my credibility, to utterly annihilate my character in order to save themselves. They would burn me to the ground to cover their tracks. And in their cold, rational plotting, I saw not a desperate family, but a pack of predators who had decided their survival was worth any cost, especially when I was the one who would have to pay it. The overheard conversation was a declaration of war. Their plan to preemptively discredit me, to paint me as an unstable extortionist, meant I was no longer just fighting for financial restitution. I was fighting for my sanity, my reputation, my very identity. My defiance could no longer be passive and silent. It had to become active and strategic. I began by turning my bedroom and office into a locked sanctuary. The first morning after their chilling conversation, I went to the hardware store and bought 2 new deadbolts with keypads. I installed them myself, my hands steady, my focus absolute. When David came home from work and found he could no longer enter our bedroom, his rage was palpable. He pounded on the door, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I didn't answer. I simply sat at my desk, listening, the solid click of the new lock, a small but significant victory. My next move was to secure my communications and assets. I went to the bank and opened a new account at a different branch, transferring the majority of my personal funds. I rented a post office box and had all my mail redirected there. I bought a cheap prepaid cell phone, a burner phone, I thought with a grim sense of irony, and began using it for all important calls. I was systematically cutting their access to my life, severing the tendrils of control they had always taken for granted. Their response was to escalate the psychological pressure within the house. The misplaced items became more critical. My car keys, for the small sedan I used for daily errands, vanished, only to reappear in the freezer a day later. My laptop charger went missing. They would unplug the Wi-Fi router when they knew I was in the middle of researching something online. These were gaslighting tactics, designed to make me question my own mind, to create a fog of confusion and frustration that would cloud my judgment. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. When my keys were gone, I calmly took a taxi. When the internet was down, I tethered my laptop to my new burner phone. For every move they made, I had a counter move. I was a quiet, determined force of resistance in my own home, and my refusal to be baited into an emotional confrontation clearly unnerved them. The turning point, the discovery that moved my fight from defense to offense, came one afternoon when they were all out of the house. A primal instinct, a surge of righteous fury, led me to Leo's room. I had never violated his privacy before, not even as a teenager. But he was not a teenager anymore, and I was not the same mother. He and Sophia had left in a hurry, and the room was a mess, a testament to their chaotic lives. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I would recognize it when I saw it. I started with his desk drawer. Beneath a pile of overdue bills and unopened letters from collection agencies, I found a thin folder. Inside was not what I expected. It contained several sheets of tracing paper, and on each sheet, in pencil, was a meticulously traced copy of my signature. I sank onto the edge of his bed, the papers trembling in my hand. He had been practicing. He had sat at his desk, like a student doing homework, and carefully practiced forging my name. The premeditation of it was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a cold, calculated fraud. He had traced my signature over and over until he could replicate it with confidence, ready for the day he would need to sign away my most prized possession. I felt a surge of rage so pure and white-hot it almost blinded me. But just as quickly, the rage cooled, solidifying into something else. Evidence. This was the proof I needed. This was the smoking gun. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was a felony. I took out my new phone and carefully photographed each sheet of tracing paper, the shaky pencil lines a clear testament to his criminal intent. I photographed the overdue bills, the threatening letters from creditors. I was no longer just a victim. I was a detective, building a case against my own family. I put the folder back exactly where I had found it, my movements precise. I left the room and locked myself back in my office. They thought they were isolating me, but they were wrong. They had given me the time and the solitude to uncover their secrets. They were fighting a war of petty psychological torments. They had no idea I was about to bring the full force of the law down upon them. My defiance was no longer about enduring their invasion. It was about ending it, permanently. The discovery of the forged signatures was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the concrete proof that shifted their act from a desperate familial betrayal to a premeditated criminal conspiracy. Holding the phone with the photos of those traced signatures, I knew that defending myself within the four walls of my home was no longer a viable strategy. The battlefield had to change. The next morning, I dressed with purpose. Not in the soft, comfortable clothes of a retiree, but in a structured blouse and tailored slacks. I looked like a woman on her way to a business meeting, which, in a way, I was. I waited until David and Leo had left for the day, and Sophia was in the shower. I walked out the front door, got into a taxi I had pre-booked on my burner phone, and left my old life in the rearview mirror. I didn't know if I would ever sleep in that house again. My destination was the office of a lawyer my sister had recommended, a woman named Margaret Atwood, a name I took as a sign of fiercely female strength. She specialized in property and fraud cases. Her office was a calm, professional space, a world away from the toxic chaos of my home. I sat across from Margaret, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I told the entire story to an impartial third party. I didn't cry. I didn't waver. I presented the facts chronologically, from the discovery of the missing car to the folder of traced signatures. I showed her the photos on my phone and the threatening letter from their lawyer. She listened intently, her expression hardening as my story unfolded. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "Catherine," she said, her voice firm but laced with empathy, "I want to be perfectly clear. This is not a family dispute. This is grand theft auto, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. What your husband and son did is a criminal offense. The fact that they are your family is irrelevant to the law." Hearing my chaotic, painful experience translated into the cold, precise language of the law was incredibly validating. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't being vindictive. I had been the victim of a serious crime. "They are trying to build a case that I am mentally incompetent," I explained, "to discredit me before I can act." "A classic, despicable tactic," Margaret nodded, "and it's not going to work. The evidence you've gathered is compelling. The traced signatures are a prosecutor's dream. Their desperation made them sloppy." She laid out my options, clearly and concisely. We could pursue a purely civil case to recover the value of the car and damages. Or we could start with a criminal complaint, which would then form the basis for a much stronger civil suit. "A criminal investigation will be more aggressive," she warned. "It will involve the police, detectives, and potentially the district attorney. It will irrevocably burn the bridge with your family. You need to be sure this is the path you want to take." I thought of my father, his hands greasy as he taught me how to change the oil in that Mustang. I thought of the years I had spent enabling my son, the decades I had spent placating my husband. I thought of the cold, calculated way they had plotted to steal from me and then destroy my name. The bridge she spoke of was already a pile of ashes. They left me no other path, I said, my voice clear and certain. I want to file a police report. That was my first true action, the first decisive step taken outside the confines of their manipulation. From Margaret's office, we went to the Central Police Precinct. I sat with a detective, a weary-looking man named O'Malley, and I told the story again. This time, it was not for empathy, but for the official record. Margaret was by my side, guiding me, ensuring every detail was documented correctly. I showed Detective O'Malley the photos of the signatures. I gave him the names and contact information for David and Leo. When I signed the official police statement, my hand did not tremble. It felt like I was signing a declaration of independence. I was no longer a victim reacting to their abuse. I was the plaintiff, the driving force of my own justice. Walking out of the police station into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a profound shift within me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. They had started a war, confident that I was too weak, too loving, too confused to fight back. They had no idea that their greatest crime wasn't stealing my car. It was unleashing the woman I had become. The law was on my side now, and I was coming for them with its full, unyielding force. The official, impersonal machinery of the law moves with a speed that is terrifying to those who have something to hide. 2 days after I filed the police report, Detective O'Malley paid a visit to my house. I wasn't there, having already moved my essential belongings to my sister's guest room, but my neighbor Carol gave me a detailed account. An official police car parked in the driveway where my Mustang used to be. A grim-faced detective asking questions for nearly an hour. The visit was not an arrest, but an initial inquiry. It was, however, a clear and undeniable signal that the game had changed. The reaction from my family was instantaneous and volcanic. Their panic was a tangible force, radiating through the burner phone in a series of desperate, frantic calls and texts. The carefully constructed walls of their narrative, the loving family concerned about their unstable matriarch, had been breached. Their first tactic was to feign utter bewilderment. David left a voicemail, his voice a masterpiece of wounded innocence. "Catherine, I just had a policeman at our door, a detective. He was asking questions about the car, about us. What on earth have you done? You've brought strangers, the police, into our private family matters. You have to call this off. It's a misunderstanding." Sophia followed with a barrage of tearful texts. "You can't do this. You'll ruin Leo's life. He'll have a criminal record. He'll never get a good job. Is that what you want for your only son?" The temptation they offered was a return to the old way, a retreat back into the toxic, secret-keeping dysfunction of the family unit. They were begging me to put their comfort above my own justice, to once again absorb the consequences of their actions. When their feigned ignorance and emotional appeals were met with my resolute silence, their strategy shifted. The panic morphed into a desperate plea for a deal. Leo called me, his voice cracking. For the first time, he sounded not arrogant or entitled, but genuinely terrified. "Mom, please," he begged. "I'll get you the money. I swear. I'll get a second job. I'll sell my watch. Sophia will sell her jewelry. We'll get it. Just call them off. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you found the car. Anything. We can't have a criminal investigation." The offer was pathetic and transparent. They weren't offering restitution out of remorse. They were offering it as a bribe to avoid a felony charge. The final, most desperate temptation came from all three of them. They sent a joint email, a formal-sounding proposal that was clearly drafted with the help of a lawyer. They offered to pay me $55,000 immediately, the pittance they had received for the car, and sign a promissory note for the remaining $20,000 to be paid in small, monthly installments over the next 10 years. In exchange, I would have to sign a legal document stating that I had loaned them the car, that the sale was a misunderstanding, and that I would formally withdraw my police complaint and cease all legal action. It was a carefully constructed trap. Signing it would not only absolve them of their crime, but it would also retroactively invalidate my entire story. It would turn their theft into my error in judgment. It would make me the liar. They were offering me a fraction of my money back in exchange for my truth. I read the email in the quiet of my sister's kitchen, a mug of tea warming my hands. A year ago, even 6 months ago, I might have considered it. The desire for peace, the ingrained habit of putting the family first, might have been strong enough to make me sign. The thought of my son with a criminal record was a painful one. But I was no longer that woman. I looked at the offer for what it was, an attempt to buy my silence, to erase their crime. My rejection was not born of anger, but of a cold, mature clarity. They were not sorry for what they did. They were sorry they got caught. They had not learned a lesson. They had only learned to fear the consequences. Forgiveness without accountability was just a prettier word for enablement, and I was done enabling them. I forwarded their email to my lawyer, Margaret, with a simple 2-word message: no deal. I then took my burner phone and, in a single cathartic action, I blocked the numbers of my husband, my son, and my daughter-in-law. I would not receive any more of their pleas, their threats, or their tainted apologies. All future communication would go through our lawyers. The rejection was absolute. It was a silent, digital closing of a door that would never reopen. There was no rage, no screaming, no final, dramatic confrontation. There was only the quiet, firm resolve of a woman who had finally learned that some things, like dignity and justice, are not for sale. They had tempted me with a return to a broken peace. I had chosen the harder, cleaner path of a righteous war. Cutting off all direct communication with my family was like closing a window on a raging storm. The silence that followed was not empty, but restorative. In the sanctuary of my sister Sarah's home, I began the slow, arduous process of healing, not just from the theft of my car, but from the 30 years of emotional erosion that had preceded it. Sarah, who had always viewed David and Leo with a loving but skeptical eye, was a rock. She never said, "I told you so." Instead, she created a space for me to simply be. She made me tea, let me sleep late, and sat with me in companionable silence when I didn't have the words to express the chasm of grief inside me. "He was never good enough for you," she said one evening as we looked through old photo albums. "And you taught Leo that a man could get away with anything as long as his mother was there to clean up the mess." Her words were blunt, but they weren't cruel. They were the truth, and I was finally strong enough to hear it. Through Sarah, I was reintroduced to a circle of friends I had neglected over the years, my social life having been slowly suffocated by the demands of my family. I met her book club, a group of sharp, funny, resilient women in their 50s and 60s. One evening, emboldened by their warmth and a glass of wine, I told them my story. The reaction was not the pity I had feared, but a wave of immediate, visceral recognition. One woman, Anna, a retired nurse, reached out and took my hand. "My ex-husband refinanced our house without telling me and gambled the money away," she said quietly. "He also told everyone I was emotionally unstable when I found out." Another, a teacher named Maria, shared her own story of an adult son whose drug addiction had nearly bankrupted her before she was forced to cut him off. "The guilt is the hardest part," she said, her eyes meeting mine with profound understanding. "They program you to believe that their survival is your responsibility." Sitting in that circle, I felt a powerful sense of community, of shared experience. I was not a singular, pathetic victim. I was a survivor, and I was in the company of other survivors. We had all been members of the same unspoken sorority, women who had loved too much and given too freely, only to have that love weaponized against us. The mutual recognition was a powerful antidote to the shame and isolation my family had tried to inflict upon me. A few weeks after moving in with Sarah, I knew I needed to perform a final spiritual cleansing. The Mustang was gone, but its ghost remained. tethered to my memories of my father. I needed to say goodbye, not just to the car, but to the life it represented. I drove to my parents' old house, which had been sold years ago, but was only a few towns over. The new owners were a young family, but the garage my father had built with his own hands was still standing in the backyard. I parked across the street and just looked at it. I closed my eyes, and I was a teenager again, covered in grease, holding a wrench for my dad as he worked under the hood of the newly acquired Mustang. He had bought it as a wreck, a passion project. "A person's gotta have something that's just for them, Kitty," he used to say. "Not for your job, not for your family. Just for your soul." For years I had thought he meant the car itself. But sitting there, across the street from his old garage, I finally understood. The car wasn't the point. The point was the lesson. The importance of having a self, an identity, separate from the roles you play for others. It was a lesson I had forgotten for 30 years. I didn't cry. I simply sat in my car and said a silent thank you to my father, for the car, for the memories, but most of all, for the lesson I had finally, painfully relearned. I said goodbye to the Mustang, releasing it from the burden of being my only connection to him. And I said goodbye to Kitty, the compliant daughter and wife who had let her own soul rust over while she diligently polished the lives of others. When I drove back to Sarah's house that afternoon, I felt lighter. A psychic weight had been lifted. The spiritual cleansing was complete. The past was no longer an anchor. It was a lesson. My family had tried to strip me of my last prized possession, but in doing so, they had inadvertently given me a far greater gift. They had given me back to myself. And with the support of my newfound sisterhood, I was ready to build a new life on that foundation. With my emotional house in order, it was time to press the attack. My lawyer, Margaret, had been methodically building our case while I had been healing. The police investigation had confirmed that the title transfer was fraudulent, and the buyer, a shady used car dealer known for such transactions, had quickly given up the vehicle and the names of the sellers to avoid being charged as an accomplice. The Mustang itself was now in a police impound lot, a piece of evidence. But I didn't want the car back. Its history was now tainted. I wanted its value, and I wanted justice. Margaret advised a new aggressive strategy. "The criminal case will proceed on its own," she explained in her office. "They will likely be charged with theft and forgery, but that won't make you financially whole. We are going to file a civil suit simultaneously. We will sue David and Leo, not just for the value of the car, but for punitive damages, legal fees, and emotional distress." She drew up the complaint. It was a work of art, a cold, factual document that laid out their conspiracy in brutal detail. It listed the forged signatures, the history of financial exploitation, the psychological abuse, and the attempt to declare me incompetent. The amount we were suing for was staggering. $75,000 for the car, plus an additional $150,000 in punitive and emotional damages. When David and Leo were served with the lawsuit, their reaction was predictably explosive. The quiet resistance I had maintained for weeks was now a formal declaration of war, and they finally understood that I would not back down. The campaign of slander they had begun with family members now escalated into a full-blown assault. They knew they couldn't win on the facts, so their only recourse was to try and destroy my character, hoping to pressure me into dropping the suit out of sheer exhaustion and shame. They told relatives I had a secret gambling problem and that I had sold the car myself and was now trying to frame them to cover my own debts. They told mutual friends that I was having an affair and was trying to bankrupt David to fund a new life with another man. They told everyone that I was vindictive, mentally ill, and greedy. The lies were vicious and deeply painful, but my resistance was built on a new foundation. My support system, Sarah, Anna, Maria, and the other women, formed a protective barrier around me. When a cousin called to lecture me about tearing my family apart, Sarah took the phone and calmly informed her that she was siding with a criminal conspiracy. When a former friend sent a text message accusing me of being cruel, Anna helped me draft a simple, elegant response. "You do not have all the facts." I hope one day you understand." I resisted the urge to defend myself publicly. Margaret's advice was clear. Let them talk. Let them lie. Every false statement they make is another piece of evidence for our case. They are digging their own graves. I focused instead on my own well-being. I started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in recovery from emotional and financial abuse. I joined a yoga class. I volunteered at the local library, reconnecting with my old passion. Each act of self-care was an act of defiance. While they were consumed with their campaign of hate, I was rebuilding my life. I was resisting not by fighting back with their own dirty tactics, but by rising above them. The most difficult moment of resistance came one evening when a large envelope was delivered to Sarah's house. It was from David's lawyer. Inside were photocopies of old, intimate letters I had written to David in the early years of our marriage. There was also a note from the lawyer stating that if the civil suit proceeded, my full emotional and psychological history would become part of the public record during discovery. It was a thinly veiled threat of blackmail, an attempt to use my own love and vulnerability against me. I sat with the letters, my heart aching for the young woman who had written them, so full of hope and trust. The old me would have crumbled. The old me would have surrendered to save herself from the public humiliation. But as I looked at the faded ink, I felt a surge of righteous anger. They were trying to weaponize my love. It was the most despicable act yet. I called Margaret. My voice was shaking, but not with fear. It was with rage. "They have copies of my old letters," I said. "They're threatening to release them." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Good," Margaret said, her voice like steel. "Let them. We'll add witness tampering and attempted blackmail to the complaint. They are fools, Catherine, and they are going to pay for it." Her unwavering confidence solidified my own. I would not be shamed. I would not be intimidated. I had nothing to hide. My love had been real. My trust had been real. Their betrayal was the only thing that was shameful. My resistance was complete. I would see them in court. The day of the civil trial felt like the final scene of a movie I never wanted to be in. I walked into the courthouse flanked by Sarah and Margaret, my own small army. Across the sterile hallway, I saw them. David, Leo, and Sophia looked diminished under the fluorescent lights, stripped of their familiar home field advantage. David had aged a decade in a few months. Leo's face was pale and drawn. Sophia huddled close to him, her designer handbag looking absurdly out of place in the somber setting. Their lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Peterson, whispered to them, but they barely seemed to register his words. They just stared at me, their expressions a toxic cocktail of hatred and fear. Peterson's strategy in the courtroom was exactly what we had anticipated. He tried to paint the entire affair as a tragic family misunderstanding. He portrayed me as a flighty, emotional woman, prone to exaggeration. He argued that the sale of the car was a desperate but necessary act, done with my tacit, unspoken consent to save our son from ruin. He tried to frame the lawsuit not as a quest for justice, but as a vindictive act of a woman scorned. "Mrs. Miller loved this car," he said to the judge in his opening statement, his voice oozing with false sympathy. "But what she loved more was control. When her family acted without her express permission to save themselves, she felt that control slip, and now she is using the full, crushing weight of the legal system to punish them for it." It was a masterful piece of fiction, but Margaret was prepared. Our case was not built on emotion. It was built on a mountain of cold, hard evidence. One by one, she dismantled their narrative. First, she called the police detective, O'Malley, to the stand. He testified that he had found clear evidence of a criminal conspiracy, including the unwilling testimony of the car dealer who had bought the Mustang for a fraction of its value, confirming he was told the seller's wife was out of town and had pre-signed the title. Next, Margaret called a handwriting expert, a forensic graphologist. He presented a blown-up comparison of my real signature and the forgery on the bill of sale. He then showed the judge the photos of the tracing paper I had found in Leo's desk. "This is not a casual forgery," the expert stated unequivocally. "This is a practiced, premeditated act of fraud. The signatory demonstrated a clear intent to deceive." The most powerful moment came when Margaret presented our financial documentation. She projected bank statements and credit card bills onto the courtroom screens, detailing the tens of thousands of dollars I had given them over the years. It was a stark, undeniable history of their financial dependency and my enablement. She followed this with the threatening letters from their lawyer and the attempted blackmail with my personal letters. A wave of murmuring went through the courtroom. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Judge Diaz, stared at David and Leo with open contempt. When Leo took the stand, he crumbled under Margaret's cross-examination. He tried to stick to his story of desperation, but she cornered him with questions about the traced signatures. "Mr. Miller," she asked, her voice quiet but cutting, "is it your testimony that you were so desperate, so overcome with panic, that you took the time to sit at your desk and practice your mother's signature multiple times on tracing paper?" He stammered, contradicted himself, and looked to his father for help, but David could only stare at his hands. Finally, I took the stand. I told my story, simply and truthfully. I spoke of my father, of my love for the car, but more importantly, I spoke of the trust that had been broken. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply presented the truth. Peterson, on cross-examination, tried to rattle me. "Mrs. Miller, isn't it true you're simply angry because your husband and son made a decision without you?" "No," I replied, looking directly at the judge. "I am not angry. I am here because my son and my husband committed a crime against me. They stole my property, forged my name, and then tried to declare me mentally incompetent to cover it up. This is not about anger. This is about consequences." The judge delivered her verdict that same afternoon. She was scathing. She called David and Leo's actions a despicable act of familial predation and a profound and calculated betrayal. She ruled entirely in my favor. She awarded me the full $75,000 for the car, another $100,000 in punitive damages for the fraudulent and malicious nature of their acts, and ordered them to cover all my legal fees, which amounted to nearly $50,000. The total judgment was for almost $250,000. Sophia let out a strangled sob. Leo looked utterly broken. David simply closed his eyes. Their defeat was absolute, a public and financial annihilation from which they would never recover. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The civil judgment, combined with the subsequent criminal conviction for forgery and theft, for which they received probation and a hefty fine, forced them into bankruptcy. David and I divorced. He had to sell our family home to pay his portion of the judgment. The last I heard, he was living in a small rental apartment an hour away, working a low-wage job. Leo and Sophia's marriage crumbled under the financial strain and public shame. She left him and moved back in with her parents. Leo was forced to take on multiple menial jobs to begin chipping away at the massive debt he now owed me, his wages garnished for the foreseeable future. For me, the verdict was not about the money, but about the validation. It was the world affirming that I was not crazy, not vindictive, not selfish. I was a victim who had fought back and won. A month later, after the judgment was paid from the sale of their assets, I walked into a Tesla dealership. The quiet, futuristic hum of the electric cars was the sound of a new life. I bought a brand new Midnight Silver Model S, a vehicle that represented everything my old life was not. Sleek, modern, technologically advanced, and powered by a silent, self-sufficient strength. Driving it off the lot, I felt a profound sense of peace. My victory wasn't a happy ending in the traditional sense. There was too much collateral damage for that. But it was a just ending. I had lost a family, but I had gained myself. They had sold my car while I was sleeping, a desperate act to pay for their past. In the end, it was they who paid, with their future, and I used that payment to drive mine forward into the clean, quiet, open road of a life that was, finally, completely my own. 6 months after the trial, the noise of my former life had faded to a distant echo. The victory in the courtroom was not an end point, but a door I had walked through, closing it firmly behind me. I had sold the house, a place whose memories had become toxic, and bought a sleek, modern condominium downtown with panoramic city views. It was a space that held no ghosts. My life began to take on a new rhythm, one of my own making. Mornings were for yoga or long walks by the river. Afternoons were spent rediscovering my love for literature, volunteering at the city library, or simply sitting on my new balcony, reading, with no one to answer to. My new Tesla was my partner in this reclaimed freedom. On weekends, Sarah and I would take spontaneous road trips, gliding silently along country roads, the car a quiet testament to the life I had built from the ashes of my old one. I had believed I was finally, completely free. I had not heard from David or Leo since the final, blistering judgment. All necessary communication was handled by our lawyers with the sterile efficiency of a corporate transaction. Their power over me, I thought, had been utterly and completely neutralized. Then, the letter arrived. It was forwarded from my old address, enclosed in a larger envelope by the new owners. The handwriting on the inner envelope was Sophia's, a looping, overly feminine script that I recognized instantly. My first instinct was to throw it away, to treat it as the piece of toxic waste it undoubtedly was. But curiosity, a final, lingering thread of my old life, made me pause. What could she possibly have to say that hadn't been said in a courtroom? I slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. The letter was 4 pages long, written on cheap scented stationery. It was not a letter of anger or threats. It was something far more insidious, a carefully crafted symphony of misery and manipulation. She wrote of their new life in a cramped, run-down apartment on the other side of town. She described Leo, not as the arrogant, entitled man I knew, but as a broken shell of a person. She wrote about him working 2 low-wage jobs, one stocking shelves overnight at a grocery store, the other washing dishes at a diner, and coming home exhausted, his hands raw, his spirit crushed. She detailed their poverty, the shame of using food banks, the humiliation of having their single battered car repossessed. "He never sleeps," she wrote. "He just sits in the dark and says he deserves this, that he destroyed the only good thing in his life. He talks about your father's car constantly, not about the money, but about the memories he ruined. He's a changed man, Catherine. The man you see now is the one you always hoped he would be. Humbled, remorseful, and utterly devastated." The letter was a masterpiece of emotional blackmail. Every sentence was designed to trigger my old programming, the maternal instinct to soothe, to fix, to alleviate the suffering of my child, no matter how self-inflicted. But the final paragraph contained the true poison. She wasn't asking for money. She knew that well was dry. She was asking for something far more valuable. "His probation officer is reviewing his case next month," she concluded. "Leo is terrified. He's so afraid they'll say he's not compliant and send him to jail. I know we have no right to ask you for anything, but if you could just write a letter or make a call, just to say that you've seen his remorse, to say that you believe he's learned his lesson, it would mean everything. It could save him. Please, Catherine, don't do it for me. Do it for the son you once loved." I put the letter down on my granite countertop. My hands were perfectly steady. 6 months ago, this letter would have destroyed me. It would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and obligation. I would have agonized for days, the needs of my son eclipsing my own hard-won peace. But as I stood there in my new kitchen, in my new life, I felt nothing but a profound and final wave of pity. Not for them, but for the woman I used to be, who would have fallen for this. I saw the letter for what it was, their last desperate attempt to make me responsible for their consequences. They had stolen from me, lied to me, and tried to destroy me. And now they wanted me to write them a reference. I picked up the letter, walked over to the sleek stainless steel trash can, and dropped all 4 pages inside. I did not rip them. I did not burn them. I simply discarded them, an act of quiet, final dismissal. They were no longer my problem to solve, my pain to carry, or my mess to clean. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, went down to the garage, and slipped into the cool, quiet cockpit of my Tesla. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just drove. As the city light streaked past my window, I felt the last ghostly chain to my old life break and fall away. They had tried one last time to pull me back into their orbit of chaos and misery, but I was already gone, moving forward with a silent, electric power they could no longer touch. A year is both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. In the year that followed Sophia's letter, I solidified the foundations of my new existence. I traveled, not to escape, but to explore. I drove my Tesla up the Pacific Coast Highway, the silent car a perfect companion for the dramatic roar of the ocean. I took a photography class and discovered a passion for capturing the stark, beautiful landscapes of the American West. I made new friends, people who knew me only as Catherine, the interesting woman with a good eye for a photograph and a quiet, self-assured strength, not as a victim or a survivor. My life was full, but it was also peaceful. The ghosts of my past had been exorcised. They no longer had the power to haunt my waking thoughts or my sleeping dreams. They had become simply a story I had once lived. One Tuesday afternoon, I had a chance encounter with that story. I was in a discount grocery store on the far side of town, picking up some specialty items for a recipe I was trying. As I rounded the end of an aisle, I saw him. It was Leo. He was wearing the faded blue vest of a store employee, stacking cans of generic brand tuna fish onto a shelf. He looked older than his years. He was thinner, and the easy, charming smile that had always been his greatest weapon was gone, replaced by a permanent exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes and mouth. His movements were slow, mechanical, the motions of a man who was not working toward a future, but simply enduring a present. He pushed a stray strand of hair from his forehead with the back of a hand that was chapped and red. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, then a wave of pure, abject shame. He immediately looked down, turning his body away from me, making himself smaller, hoping to disappear among the shelves. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no lingering maternal ache. It was like seeing a stranger you vaguely recognize from a long-forgotten television show. He was a character from a different chapter of my life. A chapter that was now closed. I calmly pushed my cart past him, finished my shopping, and left. The brief, pathetic image of his new reality was not a source of satisfaction or vindication. It was simply a confirmation. His defeat was real, it was enduring, and it had absolutely nothing to do with me anymore. 3 months later, on the 2nd anniversary of the day I discovered my Mustang was gone, I was on a solo trip through the mountains of Colorado. I had pulled over at a scenic overlook, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over a vast, breathtaking valley. I was setting up my tripod, trying to capture the light, when a man who had been admiring the view nearby ambled over. He was around my age, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "That's a serious piece of equipment," he said, nodding towards my camera. "Are you a professional?" "Just a passionate amateur," I replied, smiling back. "Well, you picked a perfect spot for it," he said. He glanced at my Tesla parked nearby. "And a perfect car for the drive up here. I've been thinking about getting one myself. Is it everything they say it is?" We talked for 20 minutes, a simple, easy conversation about cameras and cars and the beauty of the mountains. It was a normal, healthy, human interaction, unburdened by history or obligation. He was a retired architect from Denver, traveling for the sheer joy of it, just like me. When he left, he wished me good light for my sunset photo and said, Maybe I'll see you on the road again sometime. I turned back to my camera as the sun began to dip below the peaks, flooding the valley with brilliant hues of orange and purple. I thought about my father's words, that a person needed something that was just for their soul. I had found those things. It wasn't just the car or the camera. It was the silence, the freedom, the peace. It was the profound, unshakable knowledge that my future was a blank canvas, and I was the only one holding the brush. The victory wasn't the money or the car or their ruin. The victory was this quiet, solitary, beautiful moment on top of a mountain, completely and utterly free.